Welcome to The Power of Now What, a podcast on overcoming the various problems and challenges that one encounters on the spiritual path, on the journey of awakening, and even post-awakening and post-enlightenment itself. This is episode 3, titled, Would the Real You Please Stand Up? I want to talk a little about the problem of identity today. Firstly, is identity a problem at all? Is identity even an issue in itself? What are some of the problems that identity presents? And also, what happens when identity begins to fall away, which is what the spiritual path promises. The sense, all of the pains, struggles, and issues that arise around our identity. What happens when that actually begins to dissolve? What are some of the unique challenges that are presented when this actually genuinely begins to happen, which it does? Yesterday, upon the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. That is a poem called Antigonish by William Mearns. Now, that poem is about a ghost, but it could also apply very aptly and perfectly to the problem of identity as it relates to the spiritual journey. Yesterday upon the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. Now, let's just take a look at that first line. Coming into contact with somebody who doesn't exist. This is one of the things that happens on the spiritual journey. He wasn't there again today. It's the persistence of this, the persistence of an illusory identity, the persistence of an illusory ego. And then I wish he'd go away. How do we get rid of this illusion? How do you get rid of something that doesn't exist in the first place? Now, if you've never really considered the potentially illusory nature of identity, the potentially illusory nature of ego, we're going to start by doing a little exercise right here, a little meditative exercise that anyone can do at any time, and it provides incredible insight into oneself and into one's life. So I want you to cast your mind back to 5 years ago and really do this. Let's do this on a very vivid, felt and embodied level. Let's not just do this on the shallow cognitive mind level, but let's really get into the body now. Let's really get into the senses. Let's really get into the spirit right here. So cast your being back 5 years. And what were you like 5 years ago? What did you look like? What were the clothes that you wore 5 years ago? What aftershave or perfume did you wear? How did you style your hair? What was your job like? Who were the people that you were surrounded by at that time? What was your work life like? What was your family life like? What was your social circle at that time? And going even deeper, what were some of your ideas and beliefs at that time? What were some of your opinions? What was your world view? How did you perceive the world, and how did you perceive yourself 5 years ago? Is that person different to who you are now? Is that person different to who you are today? Probably. Now cast your mind back to 10 years ago. 10 years now. And really, it may take a little while because we're going back a whole decade here. It might take a little while, but really do this. Really fully embody this. It's an exercise. Don't try to do this. Don't try to create anything. It's just an an observation of what's already here, the memory of a decade ago. What were you like? What did you look like? How did you think, feel, act, behave? What was your work like? What was your social circle? How did you do your hair? What clothes did you wear? What was your opinions, ideas, beliefs? What was your worldview? How did you perceive the world 10 years ago? Is it different to how you are now? And is it different to how you were 5 years ago? And now let's go back 20 years. How about then? And you can do this exercise for any different stage within your life. And as you do this exercise, you begin to see that actually you've already, in this one single lifetime, you've already been many different people. Now, there are similarities, there's a consistency and a common thread to all of these people, but you've already been a lot of different people throughout one single lifetime. Incidentally, as a little side note, would it really be such a massive leap of faith to think that maybe you've actually lived other lifetimes as well? Because let's just recognize here that before we did this exercise, you'd completely forgotten about that person from 5 years ago, that person from 10 years ago, and that person from 20 years ago. You weren't thinking about those people at all. You can't remember. In our daily life, in our habitual way of thinking, we don't recall how we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We believe that all of these things are influencing our behavior today and are sort of why we are here today, but we very rarely think about it. And it wasn't until we did this exercise and I reminded you that you have been many different people throughout one lifetime. Would it be such a massive leap of faith to suggest that maybe somebody could remind you that you've actually been here before and lived many lifetimes before? What if you had a memory of this? Anyway, that's a separate issue. Maybe we'll talk about it further down the line. But we can do this purely from an experiential and indeed scientific perspective. You can observe that your identity shifts and changes naturally over the course of a lifetime. We don't have to do any deep, intense spiritual practice to see this. This is part of our ordinary, common experience in life. Your identity is constantly changing and shifting. So you are different. It does, this effect varies between individuals. Some people shift identity quite dramatically many times throughout their life. They're constantly changing. Other people, maybe there's more consistency, but I can guarantee that there is a difference between the you today now, the you that you were 5 years ago, the you that you were 10 years, 20 years. And you can say with a certain degree of certainty, this will continue. In another 5 years' time, do you think you're going to be the same person that you are today? Is there any way that you can predict who you're going to be in 5 years' time? There is no way of doing this. No way, because you have no idea what is around the corner. Massive changes can happen. Huge life shifts, huge experiences, both positive and negative, could be just around the corner. And this influences and changes who you are, how you see yourself, and how you see the world. It's what makes life exciting, really. The fact that you don't know what's coming next. You wouldn't want to know what's coming next. So in 5 years' time, everything's going to be different. And in another 10 years' time, completely different. And let's go 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. Hell, let's go 100 years. You're going to be very different in 100 years' time. Completely different. Yeah, completely different. We have to, it's like with a computer, when it starts malfunctioning, sometimes the best thing to do is just turn it off and turn it on again. And there you go. I've just solved the problem of life and death right there. Why do we have life and death? Well, sometimes you just need to turn it off and turn it on again. Anyway, that's beside the point. Identity. It constantly shifts, and you've just experienced this through direct experiential understanding. I didn't have to convince you of anything. You can experience this on a day-to-day basis. Now, I'm not going to fall into the trap of trying to define identity, and I'm not even going to get into just yet. I will, but I'm not going to get into just yet why some of the problems that identity presents, and why, or even if, is identity even a problem in the first place. But first, I'd like to just talk to the origins of identity. Why do we have one in the first place? As you've just seen, it shifts and changes. And if something can shift and change, is it real? It may be real today. It might feel quite solid today. You feel your identity is quite solid today. But if it can change and shift at any moment, at any point, is this a real thing? Is this a solid, tangible, separate entity? What is this thing? What is this thing called identity? Considering that this thing has the biggest influence on your daily activity, thoughts, feelings, beliefs, entire life circumstance, but it seems to just constantly run in the background. Why do we never turn around and look directly at this thing called identity? Now, when we did that exercise about the 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, was there anything consistent about that 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years self? What is it that didn't change? Can you think of anything? Is there a singular thread that ties all of those things together? Now, the common sort of response is, well, the body, my body. Well, that's changing too. That completely shifts. Your body's completely changed. Incidentally, from a purely scientific biological perspective, every single cell in your body has completely been replaced every 7 years. So every 7 years, your body has completely changed. Again, there's a consistency to it, but we can't say the body. Let's say you can't say the body because you're aware that that is changing also. Is there any common thread between the 5, 10, and 20 years self? The 5, 10, 20 years version of you? What ties them all together? Is consciousness. It's consciousness itself. And this is a huge part of the spiritual path, is recognizing that the only consistent thing in your life is that which is observing all of these changes. The only thing that's always been there, and we can guarantee will always be there, is the awareness that everything is changing. Everything changes other than the awareness. The awareness itself doesn't change. So, where does this thing called identity begin? Well, it begins in our early life. And what begins this identity? Because what begins to happen is, as we grow in awareness, we become aware that we seem to be an individual, temporary, finite, separate self. That's what the appearance is in our life. Now, the first thing that we need to take a look at is our genuine need and desire to fit into a social circle, to fit into the general society around us. And you become very aware in your early life of just how painful it is to be rejected socially. Now, let's not discount the pain, social pain. It is agony, agony. It's agony for an adult to go through social pain, to feel rejected, to feel isolated, to feel alienated, and to feel lonely. It's hard enough when you're an adult and you have all of these coping mechanisms and strategies to deal with the problems of rejection, isolation, loneliness. Imagine how difficult that is for a child before you have any coping mechanisms, before you have any strategies for dealing with this. We've all been through this process. It is agony. And we have this we have this remarkable ability to forget pain. And sorry if this is a bit much, but try to cast your being back to what it felt like as a child to not fit in. At playtime, you can't find a group to play with. Can you remember that feeling? Oh, it's awful. It's a horrible, horrible feeling to to not be able to find a group to play with, to not to feel like you don't have friends. Again, isolation, alienation, loneliness. Why don't I fit in? Why don't people like me? It's not just your peer group, your friends, but the teachers as well. You have this horrible sinking feeling that you're not doing it right, that you need to force and constrain yourself within a particular set of behaviors in order to avoid rejection, in order to avoid being an outsider. And so what happens is, I wonder if you can remember doing this as a child in your early years at school, is you try on different methods of being in order to, one, avoid the pain of rejection and also to feel the joy of acceptance. And when you're a child, your identity just shifts constantly. It's very fluid. It changes so much day to day because you go in and try a different way of being. I'm going to try and be funny today. I'm going to try and be a clown today. I'm going to try and be tough another day. There's just different ways that we constantly try, and we try out different ways of being. And through trial and error, it's standard Pavlovian conditioning that you try on a certain way of being and it seems to be accepted. You try another way of being and it's not accepted. And when it's accepted, it feels fantastic. And when you're not accepted, it feels awful. And so eventually we begin to adopt more of these behaviors and ways of seeing ourselves that will be accepted by the group as a whole. And you start to settle into this because it's exhausting, constantly changing and shifting. And so you eventually begin to settle into, well, I guess I'm this type of person then. I guess you find a comfortable and acceptable outfit, a personality. And just again, a little side note here, we get the word personality from a Greek word, persona, which means through sound. And it actually refers to a mask that they would wear in plays. And it means through sound. And so persona, personality it literally refers to a mask. And this is what happens. We put this character on, the one that will be accepted in order to avoid pain and in order to feel joy. We put this character on. And what begins to happen is that we forget that we chose to play this character. As time goes on, the character changes and shifts, but there's a huge amount of this effort to benefit ratio that happens because it takes a lot of energy to change yourself. It takes a lot of focus to try, and a risk as well, because if you try a different way of being, there's a chance that you're going to alienate your existing social group and not be accepted by the new one. I mean, I know I make light of a lot of it, but just remember the pain, remember the struggle and the difficulty, the terror, the existential terror. What if I'm not accepted? What if my deepest fear is is confirmed and that I am the odd one out? What if I am odd? What if I won't fit in? What if I don't belong? And there are various different approaches to this issue. Sometimes people go 100% into conformity and just do absolutely everything they can in a desperate attempt to fit in. That's one way of forming an identity, the one who conforms. You also get the people who attempt to say, I've had enough of all of this. I don't look, I'm tired of trying to fit in. Instead, I'm going to do my best to not fit in. And that's when you find the sort of counterculture groups. I mean, back when I was a teenager, it was like the goths and the grungers and the emos. And they often take on this persona. They often take on the identity that is quite it's always dark. It's always the opposite of the popular stuff, the popular kids, the popular way of conforming to the general social consensus is often bright. It's often bright colors. It's often the pinks, the blues, and the reds. And then the counterculture is often the dark, the brown, the black, and it's often the shadow. It's the rejection. I don't want to fit in. But then you just encounter the same old problem again. That's an identity. The identity of I am the one who doesn't fit in. And then we form a little group of people who don't fit in. And you find you're just in the same trap again. You are stuck within trying to conform to the group that doesn't conform. And they have their own social conventions of clothing and behavior and dress and music they listen to and all of that. And this is where identity comes from. It's actually a standard sort of behavioral response to social pain. And yeah, I sorry to open old wounds, but try to remember that, because we often forget how much kids are going through and young people are going through. It's so painful. And we try to laugh about it, but I believe we try to laugh about these things. Oh, remember what it was like when you were a kid. Yeah, and you didn't fit in and you got rejected by that boy or girl that you fancy, and you were hyper self-conscious of your body. You were hyper self-conscious of everything you say and everything you do. But remember the pain of that process, and you almost wince. Ooh, it was horrible. Some of the humiliation and some of the shame and guilt and regret. These are the deep emotions that we bury. We bury them deep. Open that box again and have a little look, and you'll see the origins of where your identity came from. So eventually we find an identity that isn't rejected. You find a niche to sort of slot yourself into in one way or another, because there is simply no way of getting out of the whole thing altogether. Incidentally, just as a side note, nobody fully feels accepted. Nobody. Because on the deepest level, you recognize that you only feel accepted because you're playing an acceptable character. And this works to a fairly deep level, but it doesn't go all the way down. It doesn't go all the way into the depth. You simply are aware that you're only being accepted because you've made choices to behave in a way that will be accepted. And we have this absolute existential terror, deepest down, that the real me, the authentic me, won't be accepted. And so I'm going to keep that hidden. I'm going to keep that shielded from view. Nobody's going to see the real me, because if nobody sees the real me, I can't be rejected, and therefore I am safe. This is a tragedy. Do not discount it. It is an absolute tragedy. And it happens due to the utter insanity of the modern world, of humanity in general. I say the modern world, it's actually been going on forever. You look back, even the Buddhist texts speak about this all the way back. Go back 2,500 years ago. It's the same problem over and over again, and we just don't seem to learn from it. So that's the origin of identity. And is it a problem? Is identity even a problem? Because we might just say, well, isn't that just the way things are? Isn't that just normal? Isn't that just how we organize ourselves? Perhaps, perhaps there's an element of that, and we often, I believe, fall into a trap of just saying, well, that's just the way things are. But the problem with that's just the way things are means you're never going to question anything. And if you don't question things, how can you improve things? And as to the question of, is identity a problem? To my mind, anything that causes suffering is a problem. And your identity actually causes you far more suffering than you might believe. So, as an exercise here, I wonder if you've ever had the experience of laying awake and suddenly remembering something that somebody said to you that day, and you didn't really think it was an issue at that time, but then when you're laying awake at night, suddenly you recognize that what somebody said was a dig. It was an insult, or it could have been, and now you don't know. Was that a dig? Was that a little slight at me? And it's easy to just sort of hand wave this way. Oh yeah, no, that's just normal. No, if it's stopping you from sleeping, it shouldn't be there. And this causes a massive amount of suffering. That's quite a minor example. But there are people, many people, who lay awake at night utterly in turmoil, psychological turmoil, because they feel like everybody at work hates them. They're constantly trying to maneuver themselves and change themselves in order to fit in at work, in a social circle, in their family group. And what's happening here when that happens? You feel that sort of pit in your stomach. Was that a dig at me? Or let's say you remember something that you said, something that you said earlier, and you didn't really think about it too much at the time, but now you're laying awake at night and you think, oh, I hope I didn't insult so and so. I hope they didn't misinterpret what I said. I hope they didn't feel I was having a go at them. I hope I wasn't being misinterpreted when I said that thing. And what's happening here is that this old pain that was laid down a very long time ago is suddenly being poked. It's suddenly beginning to bubble up to the surface. It's a memory of the pain you felt when you were much younger. That feeling of, what if I don't fit in? That social agony. And you don't feel it at the level of agony because you're an adult now. You have all kinds of narratives and cognitive ways of going, oh well, whatever, I don't care. But on the deepest level, within the emotional body itself, something is being poked and triggered. And it's this sense of this desperation to fit in, because we just don't want to feel the pain of social rejection. And that is why you end up with this social anxiety and this constant overthinking. What if I said something wrong? Or did somebody else, was that a dig at me? Because we're engaged in this constant social battle, this constant emotional battle of trying to fit in, trying to be accepted by the group. And this causes, this is an issue in that we have forgotten that our identity itself is a character that we created as a protective mechanism to protect ourselves from this pain, and a character that we created to play and inhabit as a method of orientating and navigating ourselves throughout the world. And now this character is suffering. but you have to recognize that it's the character that suffers. It's the illusory man on the stairs, the man on the stairs who wasn't there, who is suffering the social agony. It doesn't exist. And if I can just cast your mind back again to the exercise we did about the 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years ago, and all of those identities change. Now, have a think. What offended and annoyed and aggravated on a social level that person from 5 years ago is different to what aggravates and offends, annoys you on a social level today. Same with the 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. It's going to keep changing. It's going to keep shifting. And so this suffering, the social suffering of feeling aggravated, annoyed, rejected, social pain continually shifts and changes. The awareness of this shift and change isn't offended, isn't aggravated. The awareness itself, which you actually are, can't be offended, because that's the real self. That's the true you. That is the reality of your existence, is consciousness. And consciousness itself can't be offended, can't be rejected, can't be aggrandized. It can't fit in. It doesn't need to fit in. It is the in which we fit. Consciousness is the in which we fit. The consciousness itself is aware of this shifting identity that continually changes the way the identity orients itself within the social circle, within the social matrix. But the consciousness itself isn't ever, ever either rejected or accepted. It just is. And when you really get with this, and you really you begin to abide within this consciousness, which is what happens when we meditate, and it is what happens when we pursue the spiritual path, you begin to see that all of this pain actually is unnecessary. It actually doesn't really, although it's there, and we could maybe make the argument that the identity, the illusion, is necessary in some ways, you do begin to realize that although it's there, it's not actually what I am. And this is a massive relief. You can just call off the whole thing, and you can go back to just being pure, open, empty joy without the burden of trying to create an acceptable character. You are released of this issue. You are released of the problem. You are released of the burden. And spirituality and meditation and the spiritual path, in many ways, is the promise of a release and a relief from this process, this constant. I mean, let's really do this. Let's really go into the deepest looking here. That it's often seen as a liberation from the cycle of birth and death. That's what enlightenment is. It's often referred to as a liberation from the cycle of birth and death. To your individual soul, your individual spirit is finally released from this cycle of up, down, day, night, happy, sad, and finally the cycle of reincarnation, and finally released upwards into liberation, sometimes referred to as heavenly realms, which are always described as being places of peace and simple joy and happiness forever. No more downside. You're just in the upside for the forever, for the remainder, for eternity. Now, I wonder if the intuition of being released from the cycle of birth and death is an intuition about the release and the liberation from the cycle of a constantly changing identity, to be released from the burden of constantly having to shift and change your own behavior, your own ideas, your own opinions, your own beliefs, even your work life, friend life, family life. And as we've seen, this changes anyway. In a singular lifetime, in one single lifetime, the lifetime you're having now, you are different. Every few years or so, you are a different person. And enlightenment promises the release from this cycle. No more laying awake at night worrying about what you said, what somebody else said. What are you going to do? What have I done in the past? Maybe my past selves have done something wrong. What if my future self does something wrong? What if I make the right choices? Release and liberation from all of that. And this is what happens in meditation and spirituality. In this singular lifetime, your consciousness elevates to the point of seeing through the illusion of identity, through the illusion of ego. And you can see that it's an illusion. I believe social media has been one of the greatest things that has ever happened to humanity. I think it's fantastic. I think it's wonderful. I really think that it's been a huge blessing to humankind. The reason for this is because social media is a mirror. It is something that you can look at and see with your own eyes that identity is utterly false. Here's a great exercise you can do. Go to your own social media page and just have a look through that page and ask yourself, is that me? Because I look through I do this. I look through my own social media page and I go, who on earth is that? You know, Corin Bryant, meditation coach and personal trainer. And I look through these pictures and I go, who's that? That doesn't even look like me. It really doesn't. I only put the pictures up where I look good, because why would I do anything else? And that's not how I look. That's not how I dress. And I read some of these posts and I think, well, it's a good post, but I don't speak like that. I don't talk like that. I don't even think like that. And look, just look through your own social media profile and you can see that it's not utterly false. There's consistencies there, and it represents something about you. It represents an aspect or a facet of you, but that's all it does. And it's totally ephemeral. You can log out. You can log out, and once you've logged out, where's it gone? It's disappeared. You could delete your profile. Where has it gone? What makes us think? Technology, in many ways, is a metaphor for how we think. Technology, the dominant communication technology of the time, is a metaphor. That's a Marshall McLuhan concept. The dominant communication technology forms a metaphor for how we perceive the world, and the dominant communication technology of recent years is social media, and it's formed this it's a fantastic mirror for us assessing the errors of the way that we perceive the world. And so you can see that if your profile can be that inaccurate, think about what everyone else's profile is. Again, would the real you please stand up? Like, and then go to your social media and go back, do that same exercise of going back 5 years, go back 10 years, go back 20 years. This person is constantly changing. You won't even recognize that person from 5 years, 10 years ago. Think about what's going to change in the next 5 years, the next 10 years. Social media is one of the greatest blessings to humanity, except that most people aren't seeing that what it does for you, because it annoys the hell out of many people. People get very frustrated with social media, very aggravated by social media, And I would say don't shy away from that aggravation. Go into it. Really feel it. Really feel the annoyance. Really feel the aggravation. Because what's actually happening there is that you're trying to win the social game. And you can't find a way of doing it. Everyone's on this social. It's media. Media means entertainment. Media means games, and we're all trying this social entertainment. We're all trying this social game. Social media is the most spiritual practice. Social media is a very deeply spiritual practice if you look at it in the right way, because it demonstrates very clearly on an emotional level that the whole game is utterly false. What makes you think there is a difference between the profile that you put on a computer and the profile that you have created in your mind? In your mind, you do the same thing. You try to put this data out to the world, a physical image you try to present, a character, a series of words, behaviors, actions, ideas, opinions, beliefs that you try to present to the world in the hopes that you'll get those likes, that you'll get that sweet, sweet social approval. And just as with social media, you can log out. Log out, log out. And when you are enlightened, you delete the profile. You don't destroy the hardware, that's something else. But you delete the profile. You don't even delete the software. The hardware and software remains, but you log out and delete every single social media account that you have within your own brain. That's what enlightenment is. It is the removal of ego, the removal of the individual sense of identity, and a return to source, a return to the light of consciousness, pure, open, empty. Before all of this, before the names, before the labels, before the clothes, before the social pain, before the social ecstasy, before the rejection, and before the acceptance, before all of this, was consciousness, and it had no problems. It wasn't bothered by anything. It is the feeling before you were born. That's the feeling. Total peace, total serenity before the game began. Yeah. And that's what meditation can provide for you. And awakening and enlightenment promises this. It promises the end of this game. So I wanted to speak on what happens when this happens, because that's going to present some issues, isn't it? Don't I need my identity? What happens to my identity? What happens to my identity? How do I live in this world? Because your entire life, you thought that's the only option. I thought I had to have this profile in my head. I thought we feel like I have to have social media or I won't fit in. It's the same problem repeating itself. What happens in the post awakening, or as you approach enlightenment, before you fully delete the profile, you get these issues that arise, and that's what I wanted to discuss right here. So, firstly, there are three main post-awakening problems as we either approach enlightenment or even post-enlightenment. And the first one is the spiritual ego. And this is a very common phenomena that happens to a great deal of uh, of people who have a taste, a glimmer, a glimpse of awakening. They do some spiritual practice. Sometimes even they take some hallucinogenics or something, which I don't recommend, by the way. That's going to be a topic for a later one, but I don't recommend it. But sometimes it does happen. People take a certain hallucinogenic, psychogenic substance, DMT, psilocybin, something, ayahuasca, things of this nature, or have a glimpse through a meditative practice, or sometimes through even like a traumatic event. And that there's a taste, a glimpse of enlightenment, sometimes spontaneously, sometimes through disciplines of various spiritual practice. Maybe you've been meditating for 5 or 10 years, and all of a sudden, oh my word, it actually happens. My ego just sort of just falls away. The identity, and you see through the veil. You remember you're the actor on the stage. You remember you're just playing a character. You truly feel this. And an issue that arises is then the ego, the identity, is such a strong and powerful habit that it tries to take hold of that experience and creates a new identity based on that experience, which is purely because of habit. That is what we take an experience and we try to incorporate it into ego. We try to incorporate it into our identity. And it's very, very common in the spiritual path. I'd say it's almost inevitable. Almost. It's not always the case, but it's an almost inevitable thing that happens as somebody begins to spiritually awaken or has that experience, because we take that wonderful, beautiful, blissful experience and go, finally, finally, now I've found that thing that's going to make me socially accepted. And we take hold of it, or we try to take hold of something that isn't there and incorporate it within yourself. And it's a bit of a tragedy sometimes that people then live the rest of their lives thinking that they're enlightened, when actually all they've done is change the mask. That's all that happened. They deleted one profile and started another. And look, as with all of these problems, I am not in any way trying to suggest that I'm above all of this. I've done exactly this, and I'm still doing it right now. I mean, what's the point of this podcast if not for Corin Bryant, the ego and identity, trying desperately to come across as a wise spiritual guru? I'm trying to take my enlightenment experience, and my ego is trying to gain some kind of benefit from it. I'm aware that this is happening, and yet it's just a happening. It's a beautiful unfolding of the process and of the happening. I've done this, and you see it many times when people were wearing, suit and tie, and then all of a sudden they're wearing bright, flowery clothes, and they grow dreadlocks and get tattoos. There's nothing wrong with any of that. It's all fantastic, but you simply drop one suit and put on another. All that's happening is that you change the mask, and the spiritual ego is a very common problem in spiritual circles. Now, how do we overcome this? Well, as with any problem, awareness is key, and just knowing that it's something that does happen goes a very, very long way to overcoming that issue. Just seeing it. And I've seen it in myself so many times, and I just burst out laughing when I just look at myself and I go, yeah, it's just another attempt of ego to either aggrandize itself or protect itself from criticism, because it's that initial primal social pain that the ego and identity tries to protect. Is so powerful and so strong, and yet we go, now I'm enlightened, I don't have to feel this anymore. And so we construct an identity that we think, oh good, this will be bulletproof. This is an identity that can't be attacked. The overcoming is to realize there's no such thing in the first place. As I was walking up the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. There's nobody there. That's the pain in that poem, is that you're trying to get rid of something that doesn't exist. It's about a dropping away. And if you've noticed that you're falling into the trap of having a spiritual ego, continually just drop back, and recognize all identity is false. There's no such thing as a true identity. What's my true identity? There isn't one. There isn't one. That it's an illusion. You can't polish an illusion. You can't you can't improve. Let's say you have a picture of a car and you want to do some work on the car. You want to make the car better. You want to improve the engine. You want to give it a new lick of paint. You want to change the tires on this car. You've forgotten it's a picture. Just realize it's a picture and the problem disappears. The ego is an illusion. It's not real. And if you notice you've come into spiritual ego, recognize that that too is an illusion. It's false. You got tricked again. you fired somebody, and then they've turned up the next day for work, and you've gone, oh, okay, then you just carry on. That's what's happened. So that's number one, the spiritual ego, the problem there, and how to hopefully overcome it. Just recognize it's false. It doesn't exist. It never did. It never will. You will never create a true, real identity because there's no such thing. You are infinite universal consciousness, open, empty, spacious, pure, a blank screen, just like everybody is. Secondly, there are three of these problems and solutions. Secondly, what to do when it actually happens. I mean, don't I need my identity to function in life? Isn't my identity tied to my aspirations, my wants, my dreams, my goals? Isn't my identity my life? I thought it was my life. And when it actually begins to fall away, you start to go, well, what now? This is why I called this the power of now what. It's a wonderful problem to have when you actually find yourself you wake up one day and you go, that's weird. My identity's gone. My ego's gone. And this isn't a problem. You don't go, no, because your body's still there. Your experience of life is still there. Only now you are released of your burden of having an ego and an identity. And every now and then you find yourself in a situation where you think, well, what do I say in a certain circumstance? What do I do? What do I do with my day? There's no identity here anymore. If you feel this creeping in, it's just more of the same sense of control, of fear, control, desire, and it's a habitual, maybe not habitual, it's a residual ego. It's like if you've been wearing face paint, no matter how many times you wash it off, you still get there's little bits of that face paint that are always stuck in your hair and around your ears, and you find it for weeks. If you've been to a party where you've been wearing face paint, it's a nightmare to get off, and that's it. That's the ego. It's quite a good analogy that you've been wearing face paint for a very long time, and it started to stain your face, and so you wash it all off, and you do a fairly good job, but for a while the color kind of remains on the face, and you find it in your hair and around your ears, and you find it for weeks and weeks after you've actually washed the paint off. And that tends to be what happens as you find yourself in that post-awakening state without ego and without identity. Every now and then you go, oh wait, what if I forget the rules? What if now I'm completely blank, open, empty, spacious, pure consciousness? I don't fit in. Well, that's the voice of fear, and that's that little ego that's finding a little crumb of face paint in your hair, as you just go, oh, what if I don't fit in? And then you remember again, there's nothing to fit into. You are the in which it fits. There's no such thing. There are no individual people. There's nothing to be afraid of. There are no individual separate identities. Everybody is the same infinite universal consciousness. All is well. You just feel this sense of love. I just love everyone. It's not to say I like everyone, but I love everyone, whatever form that they've taken, however they act, however they are, however they present themselves. It's all just fantastic. I just love it, the whole thing. And as you immerse deeper and deeper into this sense of love and peace, you start to feel it towards yourself, your individual expression of the universal consciousness. In many ways, you finally get that thing. You finally begin to be authentic. And that is something that a lot of people try to do, and yet they form an ego and an identity in order to try and be authentic, and it can't be done. No ego is authentic. No identity is authentic. You're playing a game. Drop it. Pack it in. It's so obvious when you see it. And it's so obvious to see in other people when you see it. In order to, that it's one identity, a common identity people take on is, I don't care what people think. But they've taken on the identity of, I don't care what people think, because they care so much about what people think. It's too painful. And so they try to step out of the whole thing. The unique thing about enlightenment, awakening, and liberation is that you realize there are no people. That's a hard one that's a hard belief to drop, the belief in billions of individual separate people. There aren't any. There aren't any. They don't exist, not in the way that you think they do. We are all the same infinite consciousness. There are no individual identities. And so there's nothing to protect yourself from on the social level. You can't aggrandize yourself on the social level. You can't be rejected on the social level because there's no such thing. So the problem of how to orientate yourself in the world without an identity, as with many things on the spiritual path, eventually it just isn't an issue. It just isn't the problem that you think it's going to be. The third of the post-awakening problems. So we have the spiritual ego that we end up picking up. We have, what do you do when it actually happens? And then we have the third post-awakening problem of, it's quite a difficult one to sort of talk about, really, because it's incredibly painful. In many ways, the ego, the sense of identity, is a protective mechanism that we have created to protect ourselves from a lot of psychological and emotional pain. And once you drop that ego and identity, it feels wonderful and superb, and yet you are also going to be subject to all these old feelings resurfacing. Sometimes this is called the dark night of the soul, the dark night of the ego, the dark night of the mind, the dark night of the will, because you drop the mask and you subject yourself to the raw experience of life itself, everything that it contains. Spiritual life is the universal yes saying to everything. You're not just accepting the ups, you accept the downs, you accept the pain alongside accepting the happiness, joy, peace, and love. And when you drop your mask, you take your armor off. You've had enough. You drop your sword, you take your armor and shield off, you take your mask off, you take off the whole persona, and you are going to be subjected to everything that you've been burying your entire life. I'm not saying this to put you off. I'm saying this to prepare you for what's coming. And don't worry about it. It's going to happen, but by the time it happens, it won't be an issue for you. It will be painful. This is a very common problem that happens when people finally awaken and are liberated. Everything we buried. So you go right back to when you were at school, and let's go to the grim bit, the bit you've really been hiding from. The humiliation. It's often humiliation at the root cause of what we've been burying, or shame, guilt, fear, depression, anxiety. We've been burying it for such a long time, and let's say maybe you wet yourself in front of everyone, something like that. It happens, and we laugh about it like later on. But remember that pain. That's the same pain that's going to come up when you drop your ego, which is why awakening and enlightenment is so difficult, because we don't want to, because on some level we know what's coming. You're going to have to go through this again. Only this time, you're going to go through it as infinite universal consciousness. You're going to go through it with such a level of peace and strength that it can be processed now. A child can't process horrible, painful emotional experiences, and so the child puts it on the later base. The child saves it for later, or buries it in the body, or it comes out in very destructive or maladaptive ways. And these are all buried and stored in your mind and body. Sorry to tell you this, but it's true. And every time you got rejected by that boy or girl, every time you couldn't find somebody to play with, every time you didn't know what to say, you didn't know where to stand, every time you were terrified about the school dance, all of these events, every time you went for a job and didn't get it, every time that you were acting like the biggest egomaniac at work, and you got called out on it, every time, every error, every mistake you've made, every argument, not the content of the mind, but the feeling in the body will arise again as the ego and identity drops away. And you then experience this dark night of the soul, because you no longer have the protective control mechanisms that you usually do. And people adopt many of these patterns of thinking. That, so a common one is that, like, well, I just don't care what anyone thinks, I don't care. Or perhaps we blame other people. So maybe, well, I feel ashamed and embarrassed, but that's everyone else is judging me, so it's their problem, it's not my problem. It's because everyone else, it's other people's problem. And on a cognitive, shallow level, this works. We mask, we paint over the cracks, and we don't feel the pain too viscerally. But when all of that goes, when you're no longer trying to protect yourself from this pain, you find yourself in a bit of a free fall, and it can be quite disorientating. I just want to be honest with what I'm talking about here, because I think what stops a lot of people from truly awakening is that they were expecting enlightenment to just feel fantastic all the time. They were just going to be jumping around for joy every single moment, and are quite surprised to find, hang on a minute, all of my old demons are coming out to play. But it's a good sign. In many ways, the pain that you feel, the problem that you feel, is actually a good sign. It's a sign that the ego identity, the control mechanism, the protective, the coping strategy is falling away. And so the fact that this pain is arising is actually a sign that you're doing well in your spiritual practice. The solution to this dark night of the soul, and I'm not going to say that it's pleasant, because it from the perspective of the individual, it's incredibly unpleasant. But on a deeper level, you just know it's okay. And the only solace I can give you, because you're going to feel grief. Interestingly enough, people that awaken actually go through a grieving process because they grieve the person they thought they were. You have to remember that you're grieving a ghost. You're grieving somebody that never existed in the first place. You're grieving for an idea of what you thought it could be, but drop that. Has it worked so far? Have your plans worked? Are you fulfilled? Are you truly happy? Has this character that you're playing, is it working? Is it ever going to work? Are you ever going to find that acceptable one? It's never going to happen. And you have to grieve this. Grieve what you thought it was going to be. Happiness doesn't work like that. There is no happiness for an individual ego. the only happiness in life is from release, freedom, liberation, to feel life as it is. Life experience without ego. That is happiness. When we feel happiness, we're feeling it because we are released of our responsibilities, our burdens, and our emotional pain. When we enjoy ourselves, it's because you're on holiday and you are released of everything. You're free to simply experience life as it is. That's what it feels like when you finally awaken. You are finally released of the burden of trying to be a person. And so you go through this grieving process, and it's just a sense of even your spiritual practice won't help you at this point. It sounds horrifying. I'm really painting this out to be horrifying, but on the other side of this is true liberation, true freedom. You're going to go through it and just understand. But yeah, so even your spiritual practice, you recognize that in many ways your spiritual practice is also just a protective mechanism. Even when you sit down to meditate, it's the identity that sits down to meditate. It's the ego that sits down to meditate. You find yourself in this real feedback loop, and nothing will work, but that's the point. Just drop everything. Stop trying to control. In many ways, I think what happens with the dark night of the soul is that it's the phenomena of when you're on a diving board, you're really high up and you're trying to talk yourself into diving off. You know it's going to be the most incredible experience, the most exhilarating, joyful experience to just dive off this board and plunge into the water. You know it's going to be a lot of fun if you can just pluck up the courage to do it. And what happens is people finally do it. They finally leap and then panic at the last minute, turn around as they're falling and grab hold of the diving board. And people clutch onto the diving board, and now you end up in this bizarre half in, half out state where you're no longer standing on the diving board, but you're also not experiencing the joy of the dive and this plunge into the water because you're desperately clinging to the side. You're half in and half out, and that's the dark night of the soul. You're still feeling the terror of being stood on the board, but you don't have the luxury of being stood on the board. You're hanging by your fingernails, but you're also not enjoying the freedom of the free fall. And that's what happens with Dark Night of the Soul. And that's the third spiritual issue that we need to overcome in this post-awakening world. And that's pretty much everything on identity. As I was walking up the stair, I met a man who was not there. He was not there again today. I wish he'd go away. Would the real you please stand up? It's probably worth just adding a note here on the current identity crisis that the world seems to be going through. I don't want to speak to the specifics of identity politics because Lord knows it's a minefield. But I would suggest that the entire thing is a huge red herring. People are on a wild goose chase when it comes to identity. If you apply a lot of the things that I've discussed here, you'll see where the issue is arising. The issue with a lot of identity comes down to can we make the group simply accept everyone? Where does the responsibility lie in creating acceptable identities? Is it the group or the individual? This is the common issue when it comes to identity, and the root cause of identity politics is exactly that. Who decides on the identity? Is it the individual or the group? And what if I decide I am this identity, the world has to conform to what I say? Or is it the other way around? Does the world tell you who you are, and it's your responsibility to conform to what the group says? I mean, I go through it. I mean, I call myself a personal trainer. For many years, I'm just identified as a personal trainer. And even when there's nobody around, I feel guilty if I'm not eating broccoli, chicken, and rice. I shouldn't be eating these biscuits. I shouldn't be eating these biscuits. I should be eating broccoli. And that's an identity issue because no one cares. I certainly don't care. I don't eat a great deal of broccoli, but my ego and my identity, because I call myself a personal trainer, that kicks in. This is the man on the stairs, the ghost in your head that doesn't exist, that says you shouldn't be eating biscuits, you should be eating broccoli because you're a personal trainer. What? What? That doesn't make sense. I mean, maybe on some level it kind of makes sense, but that's the issues of identity, really. And the current climate, as we'll say, of the identity politics. It's everyone's discussing. This is what I see a lot of the time when it comes to people discussing identity or discussing many problems that we, in air quotes here, society has, is people discussing the problem of Bigfoot, and everyone's trying to discuss, well, what does Bigfoot eat? Where does Bigfoot live? How does Bigfoot's how do they organize themselves? Like, what is this thing? What is this creature? Well, like, where does it come from? And it's the entire world is lost in this discussion of like, what are we? What we really need to understand Bigfoot, and there's all this discussion about something that simply doesn't exist. It's a myth. It's not there. So any discussion around ego and identity is really a discussion about an illusion. And if we could simply see this for what it is and go back in the other direction, in many ways, the issues with identity recently has been created by social media. And this is a hell of a clue. There's a very deep clue. It's an illusory problem created by an illusory entity. If we could go in the other direction and realize, oh, there's a massive problem with something, I wonder if the problem is that it's not real. Yeah. Trying to find an image, a self-image that will be accepted. And it's not about trying to improve the image. It's not about trying to create an acceptable you. It can't be done. There is no acceptable you. You will only find your authentic self and live your authentic life when you realize, I mean, in many ways, you can't be anything other than yourself. You hear this in your language all of the time. I just don't feel like myself today. I'm not being myself. I need to find myself. I need to really become myself. What are you talking about? How can you be anything other than yourself? No matter what you do, say, feel, think, act, you are never anything other than consciousness. Ever. It can't be done. So relax. Relax and let go. As I was walking up the stair, I met a man who was not there. He was not there again today. I wish he'd go away. Thank you for listening to The Power of Now What, Episode 3, with the real you. Please stand up. If you enjoy and benefit from my meditations and talks, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. It only costs $2.99. That's less than the price of a coffee these days. Also, please feel free to give me some stars. You can give me 5 stars on my Spotify page. That goes a long way to helping me out. It really does. Goes a long way to supporting me and my work. You can find me on Facebook, Corin Bryant, meditation coach and personal trainer. Follow me on Spotify, Corin Meditation Coach. Find me on Instagram, Corin_Bryant_. And on YouTube, Corin Bryant. Sorry, I've just realised I'm going through a massive social media plug after just being very disparaging towards social media. The irony. The irony. You see, I still fall into the traps. Thank you for listening, everyone. Take care, be well, and stay present.